CMMC. Why you dealing with a cyber threat when you know you got an era right? Yeah, you are not alone, don't do it by yourself. Get you some defense will help. If you know you won't be cyber free, come and get you some COC. Satisfying controls, lock them access points. We won't disappoint. COC, fight cyber threats. Promise you will not regret. We go deep and penetrate. COC, come and see.
Hey, all right. Welcome back for yet another episode of Crump on Cyber. I'm your host, your Sherpa, your guide, Jeffrey Crump. All right, I'm very excited about today's episode around something called FedRAMP. Okay, so there's a lot kind of going on and with regard to this new DoD cybersecurity maturity model certification, and it's coming into play, and there's so many questions out there, right? And so we need to look at this, and so we're going to do a session, part one on FedRAMP, and then we're going to do part two targeted for September 21st. And the first session here, we're going to focus on just lay down the foundations, talk a bit about what FedRAMP is and what it's intended to be, and some of the legal regulatory stuff that sits in the background and what's driving this to occur. And yes, we will look at some of the legal regulatory stuff related to the CMMC and how that comes into play. We're going to set the tone because that's really kind of where the path that we're really kind of headed down here. And then in the next part, scheduled for September 21st, we'll get way down in the weeds. Okay, so we're going to have some folks on that session that are actually we're going to look at real evidence, okay, a real body of evidence that's associated with this. And so that should be very impactful. For today's session, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, and then we've got a special guest coming on a little bit here, Alexy Johnson, who comes from Sarah Bryn. They are in the FedRAMP space, so we've got a real subject matter expert in this area. So FedRAMP, Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program for Cloud Service Offerings. Okay, so this thing was established in 2011, and what they're looking for is a cost-effective, risk-based approach for federal government adoption of cloud technologies. So you got this newfangled thing called the cloud. The federal government's like, hey, we want some of that, right? Let's take advantage of that. And so, they stood this thing up, and in December of last year, as part of the FY23 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, they actually codified this program, this FedRAMP program, as the authoritative standard approach for security assessments and the authorization of cloud products and the use for the federal government. So, it's targeted for the federal government, really. But before really kind of FedRAMP vendors, they're really required to meet these different security requirements for each federal agency. So before FedRAMP, it was a little bit of the Wild West. And so they came up with FedRAMP and created a standardized approach to really kind of understand the risk associated with these cloud products. Now, some of the legal background. So we've got something out there called the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. We have FISMA, which is the Federal Information Security Management Act, came out in 2002, and then there have just been a number of kind of incremental updates to it. But the Modernization Act comes out in 2014 and says that, hey, you got to be able to protect sensitive information. And there's a lot that kind of rolls underneath what that sensitive information is. We see that now, playing out in this CMMC, where we've got federal contract information and we have controlled unclassified information that's there, and they fall under this umbrella of sensitive information. There's also something called the Office of Management Budget, OMB Circular A130, and that states that, hey, if an agency is going to implement this FISMA, this requirements here at the federal level for information security, they need to use the security standards and guidelines coming from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. Okay. All right. So we got FISMA lays out some requirements to protect the sensitive information. You got OMB A130. It says, hey, you're gonna implement that FISMA stuff. You use the standards procedures from NIST. Fair enough. So the standards that are being implemented or utilized, the security controls for FedRAMP, come from or rooted in something called NIST Special Publication 800-53. There's baseline controls in there. Now, there are also in FedRAMP those baseline types of controls, but there are also some additional parameters and guidance that are above the NIST baseline because of the unique requirements and the unique challenges for a cloud computing environment. So this FedRAMP is really designed for cloud service providers who want to sell their wares to the federal government. And some sources say that, well, you know what? That's not an inexpensive or short journey. So some estimates out there, $2 million, 2 years. Okay, so clearly not every company that has developed a cloud service offering is going to be able to kind of go down that path, and frankly, maybe they just don't want to to sell to the federal government, and that's perfectly fine. Now, in addition to that, then we got to now that we're kind of into this space in FedRAMP, and we talked a bit about this thing called the CMMC. Well, we've got something called the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement 252.204-7012. Now, that thing's called Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting. Now, just the title of that, that cover defense information, you can kind of think of that as the DoD's CUI, and CUI is controlled unclassified information. We talked about a little bit about controlled unclassified information in some other segments, but it's information that requires some kind of safeguarding or dissemination control protection in there. When it talks about safeguarding, well, we'll take a look at this thing. Let me bring it up here to the stream. You can take a look at this. This is DFARS 252.204-7012. Okay, lots of interesting stuff in here. Certainly understanding what covered defense information, but there's the cyber incident reporting. So it's got two main really kind of elements to it. It's got the safeguarding element, and it's got the incident reporting element. Okay. So when it gets into the adequate security, that's the safeguarding kinds of elements in there. And in here, it does a little bit of a wonky little dance around, okay, well, which controls apply to me? Well, and it starts off and says, well, okay, if you're operating an IT system and surface on the behalf of the government, well, then here's the things that apply to you. And you can see some reference here to cloud computing services here. Okay, but when it comes to the CMMC, it's not really what we're focused on here. We're talking about contractors that are building these unique products for the government. So that one doesn't really fit real well for us from a definition to figure out what controls apply to us. So we go down here, we look at number 2, and it says, well, covered contract information systems that are not part of that thing. It's like, okay, so I'm not that, so therefore I'm this. Yeah, okay, fair enough. All right. And then it's in here, then it begins this journey about, well, what's this safeguarding? And in here, it talks about the implementation of 800-171. Okay, well, we'll certainly hear about that again, but 801.71, but 801.71 is really not built necessarily with the cloud in mind. So what they did is they added a little section down here. We got in here. It says, hey, if the contractor intends to use this external cloud service provider to process, store, transmit CUI, then that contractor needs to require and ensure, right? So there's some expectation here, right, of action that that cloud service provider, that external cloud service provider meets these minimum security requirements outlined in something called FedRAMP moderate. Okay, now we're back to this FedRAMP stuff. Okay, so we got this requirement for FedRAMP moderate, and in there it also talks about requirements for complying with the cyber incident reporting, and there's some other kinds of elements that are in there. But we have this, we've got a lot of focus on this 7012 because this new DoD cybersecurity maturity model certification, the CMMC thing, brings 7012 front and center because this ecosystem that's being built is being built to do a couple of different things. Now, number one, help organizations better understand these controls because up until now, not a lot of them are actually implementing them. And then for the lower kind of level contractors that are out there, what they've been exposed to is something called FAR 52.204-21. That outlines some 15 security controls, and it says that, hey, if you've got this contract with federal government, anywhere across the federal government, you're receiving this FAR clause, and it's got in there some basic controls in there, but it's pretty anemic. Outside of that, there's nothing else in there to help a contractor understand what the heck these controls mean. So what's nice about the CMMC is they've gone off and they've taken some of this information that's sitting in NIST 800-171 and its corresponding assessment guide, and it's brought it into the CMMC documentation. And in there's more details about, okay, what do these control means? Even these things that are sitting in FAR 52.204-21, what do they mean? Tell me, help me understand what these controls are. So for contractors who are going to, doing business with the DoD, they're getting a bit more of a leg up with regard to understanding the controls because all the other agencies that are divvying out the FAR clause all by itself, well, those contractors are likely struggling a bit to understand just what the heck those controls mean. So the CMMC lays out this, really kind of a three levels in here. And so at level one, you're dealing with this stuff called federal contract information. And yeah, you got these 15 controls from FAR 52. Then we jump up to level 2. And that's where there's going to be these independent third-party assessments being conducted for organizations that are dealing with this stuff called controlled unclassified information. And then there's a level 3. Will also be independent assessments, but those are going to be led by the government, and the controls associated with that will be some subset of the ones that are in something called NIST SP 800-172. So we got this 7012 front and center because it's making this reference about the security controls that are required, and we got 171 in there, but then we also have this reference to the equivalency for FedRAMP moderate. Okay. So now that we've got this, 800-171, and that's really kind of the foundation for the CMMC assessments. But 171, we know, doesn't really speak directly to that cloud stuff. But we know it's hanging over there in that 7012 world. And okay, so what do I do if I'm if I'm coming into a contractor and they've got a bunch of assets and things like that, and that 171 stuff's going to be very handy for that. But if they're using an external cloud service provider, then hey, if these 171 controls aren't really directly in line to the cloud, what do I do? What's my assessment objective? What am I supposed to do if this external cloud service provider is being utilized? Yeah, there's nothing in the the documentation today, 171, that speaks to that. Nothing about the assessment guide speaks to that kind of stuff. But if we go out and we look, there's something out there called the DFARS FAQ. And the latest edition of that is 115. And in there, interesting document. If you're playing in the CMMC game, you definitely need to be familiar with this thing called the FAQ. But interesting because it poses questions and then we get these answers, right? So it's and their questions posed, just like you and I would pose these questions. So and they respond in a bit of a conversational tone. So in there, okay, well, how do I, if I'm a contractor and I've got this external cloud service provider and I've got this clause says 7012, how do I do this require and ensure element that you now have made me responsible for? Well, the only place you're really going to find an answer to that question is in this FAQ. And in there, they say, in the same way the contractor would normally ensure that any service or product being contracted for would meet the requirements. A body of evidence. Okay. Any examples? Oh, sure. An SSP, a system security plan from that cloud service provider, and or a customer responsibility matrix. Okay. Fair enough. That body of evidence, well, we're gonna save that conversation for our part 2 next month. But in the world of FedRAMP, there are third-party assessment organizations out there called 3PAOs. Okay, not to be confused with what we've got in the CMMC third-party assessment organization, C3PAOs. Okay, very different kind of thing. The C3PAOs are the ones that are going to be doing those third-party assessments that I mentioned at level 2. The 3PAO, these are the ones that are authorized to perform these initial and periodic cloud, assessments of the cloud service providers to ensure that they can ongoing compliance and conformity to the FedRAMP requirements. Fantastic, right? So the use of 3PAOs is required, but for one type of FedRAMP authorization. And there's also independent verification and validation that can be done as well. So there's an entity out there that can do these types of verifications, third party independent verifications of this FedRAMP moderate that we're kind of looking for here. But in the current form of the CMMC, there is nothing that's says outright that, hey, if you're gonna do this stuff, then you're a contractor, then you need to go use a 3PAO or IVNV, some entity out there, some independent verification of this FedRAMP moderate equivalency. It just doesn't call for it, not in its current form. Things can change. We're in the middle of rulemaking. We've got lots of stuff kind of happening and changes when it comes to the CMMC. So who knows, right? We kind of stay tuned. But as it stands today, yeah, it's kind of, it's putting this burden on the contractor because they have to require and ensure. And then they are to look at this body of evidence and SSP and shared responsibility and, hey, trying to figure out, is this good? Not good. What is it? Well, let's chat about that with Alexy. Let me bring Alexy Johnson on the line here. All right. Alexy, welcome to Crump on Cyber.
Good evening, Jeff. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Yourself?
Fantastic. I'm glad to be on with you tonight.
Excellent. So maybe spend just a few minutes, a bit about your background and the company that you work for and what they do.
Well, personally, I'm a retired Air Force guy. I did cyber systems and moved into information assurance shortly before I retired. And after retirement, I moved on, started working for Sarah Brin, where I started working with the FedRAMP team and started doing audit and advisory work. And that was primarily what our role was. Late last year, we actually were purchased by Jeff Farr, and we actually expanded our capabilities a little bit further, where we moved just from in the audit and advisory and compliance space to where now we offer managed services and managed security services. So we've always done the compliance thing where we were FedRAMP assessors and we assessed where we were PCI QSA company, but now we offer managed services and managed security services as well, in addition to the incident response and the forensics that we were already doing also. But in a nutshell, that's primarily what we do.
Brilliant. So we've come to the right person for
Absolutely.
absolutely. So yeah, brilliant. I'm very excited to hear about this. So maybe just I'd mentioned earlier that okay, we got FISMA and says hey, you gotta get, or OMB circular, hey, if you're gonna do this stuff, this FISMA, and you got to use NIST, and then FedRAMP comes along and 853. Maybe elaborate on this thing called 853 and a moderate baseline, right? So we hear moderate, that obviously makes us feel like, okay, then there's what, one above, one below,
Right.
So how does that kind of fit in? What's that all about? Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So before I get to moderate, I'll just start with the word baseline. Baseline can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. So I'll just say that a baseline is really a grouping. Let's just call it a grouping of safeguards. Low, medium, and high. Moderate is the medium. It's a grouping of safeguards that is a minimum. So a moderate baseline is a moderate grouping of safeguards that are required to be met. So taking that a step backwards, a moderate grouping is really based on information that's stored within the system. You determine the level of safeguards that are required to be implemented based on the type of information that's going to be stored in the system. So where do they get that type of information from? Well, there are federal information processing standards, and there are a lot of them, specifically FIPS, Federal Information Processing Standards, FIPS 199 is what contains that information. It specifically calls out the CIA triad, or confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and they assign different impact levels to those particular items in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And depending on the value for impact, that's where you determine which baseline you'll use. So, for example, let's just say you have data. If you have, I believe you mentioned OMB earlier. Let's just use financial data, for example. If you were to say the confidentiality value for some type of financial data was low, and maybe the integrity value for that type of data was moderate, and the availability impact value was moderate, you put all of those together, the highest value is moderate. So the requirement would be moderate baseline. Uh, However, the agency, they may have other factors to consider, and they may decide to raise that level to high, but at a rudimentary level, typically it's based on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability impact levels to determine what the categorization of the system would be. So it would be a moderate level. That's typically what you do to determine what the level of, or the impact level of your system would be when deciding whether you're going to be low, moderate, or high with the security control baseline as determined for NIST 853.
Okay, so I've got categorization that I've done for my information, and then I have to go select some controls or make sure I've got the appropriate controls. And so from FIPS 199 into maybe FIPS 200 and doing some selection of controls in the 853 moderate baseline. Okay, so can you expound on that moderate baseline? What are we going to see in there, and how maybe does it how different is it from 800 171, and that, what's that relationship like there?
So the relationship between the NIST 853 baseline, well, first, before I go there, let me just mention that CUI, that was the beginning point of ultimately what you're talking about here. when it comes to CUI is so vast in terms of categories. When the CUI rule came out, they actually decided in 2016 that the value of it was going to be moderate across the board at a minimum. So no matter what,
Right. Right.
nobody can make a decision to say it's a low impact value. So right out the gate, NIST
So that
853, if you decide to build a system federally, it has to start at NIST 853 as a baseline. So there's no choice. It has to start at the moderate baseline. So if you're a
brilliant.
federal system and you have CUI, NIST 853 is the minimum standard that you're required to meet. So when you decide to be a non-federal system, I don't believe they wanted to put the burden. This is Alexy speaking. I don't believe they wanted to put the same burden that they have from a FISMA reporting standpoint on the rest of the world in terms of non-federal organizations, because confidentiality, integrity, and availability can be fairly costly, and the ways that you implement those types of things in your systems can be very expensive, very, very expensive. So what they decided with NIST 800-171, rather than dictate to companies how you're going to deal with integrity and availability, integrity, of course, being guarding against improper modification or destruction of data, and dealing with availability, ensuring the timely and reliable access and use of information, they decided for NIST 800-171, we're going to ensure that you deal with preserving authorized restriction on information access and disclosure, including means from protecting personal privacy and proprietary information. That's what NIST 800-171 is designed to do. So a lot of times when people look at it, they wonder why things like redundancies and resiliency isn't built into it by design. Well, that's because it's only concerned primarily with the confidentiality of CUI at the moderate impact level versus integrity and availability. So it's only designed to just capture confidentiality. So I wanted to make sure that was mentioned, because there are a lot of things that are missing, but they're not really missing because it was intentionally done by the design of it all.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thanks for elaborating on that. So, uh, yeah, so somebody made some decision about the moderate impact level, and then the controls are selected, and then hey, they came along and said, look, we want this thing, there's something to focus on confidentiality, and so they went through some kind of a tailoring process through those controls, and that's kind of how we end up with 800-171. But we still got this big body of 853 sitting out there in this moderate baseline. 171's got 110 controls. What do
Right.
we have? What do we have sitting there at FedRAMP moderate? How many controls are sitting in there?
FedRAMP moderate actually has 325. And now
Okay.
I'm I have to remember correctly. It could be 327. It did change to revision 5 fairly recently, so 325 was the number for revision 4. It may have jumped just a little bit. Don't fact check me on that, but 325 was the count for 324. So what changed was it's 261 for Rev 4 for NIST 853 moderate baseline, but there are additional controls that get added when you consider the risk to cloud computing. FISMA uses the risk management framework, which I believe is captured in NIST 800-37, as the method for how they select controls based on the risk to how they're going to do business. Well, when you add the element of cloud computing, there's additional risk that has to be thought about. So when you do cloud computing, inevitably there's going to be additional risk because all the access is considered to be remote. So the federal government is going to be accessing these systems remotely. So there's additional controls that have to be considered, because everything is going to have to flow through some level of demilitarized zone or DMZ. There's extra controls that are going to have to be built around DNS security and DNS filtering. Most of the times, there's probably going to be some extra controls around software development and input validation in terms of how the software development is going to take place. And a lot of those things aren't necessarily included in the regular moderate baseline for NIST 853. So there are lots of additional controls that had to be considered when they considered what was going to be included in the FedRAMP moderate baseline.
Okay. So we've got this big body of controls that apply to this cloud service provider. But then we have this 7012 thing that puts some responsibility on the contractor. So we've got some responsibility here, some responsibility here. So who's responsible for these cloud security controls? How does that get, do they get divvied up, or how's that work?
So it's a very interesting question. And lots of companies, when they see that the contractor shall require and ensure, the first thing that a lot of companies say to themselves, well, how am I supposed to require and ensure? Well, really, it's a contract action, much like the DFAR is a contract action. You require and ensure through your contract actions, and you should establish some level of monitoring through your contract actions. Obviously, you're not going to go in and you're not going to actually check yourself to see if these companies are doing these things, but there should be some level prior to question and answer 115 being published. There should be some level of compliance report that you should have been requesting from these companies so that they could validate and attest to you that I am meeting these requirements. You have various reports like SOC 2 and SOC 3, different types of reports that used to be available. They didn't meet the FedRAMP requirement, but they were types of reports that were designed to speak to the various types of compliance that a company would meet. But now that we have question and answer 115, those are ways that a company could prove their level of compliance. But it could even go one step further. And some companies, for marketing purposes, they will hire a FedRAMP recognized third-party assessment organization to actually perform a FedRAMP style inspection or audit of their environment and provide a letter of attestation that speaks to the level of compliance in terms of how they conform to the FedRAMP requirements as a marketing tool, but also to attest to what level of compliance they're meeting. And companies can utilize those types of documents to validate bodies of evidence as well.
Yeah, and it's kind of what I was saying before. It's like, okay, look, I've got some risk here, right? And one, yeah, we talk a lot about, okay, well, you need a plumber, you call a plumber. You need a cybersecurity person, you call a cybersecurity person. You need somebody to validate FedRAMP equivalency. Well, you probably ought to go to some experts that can do that for you, right? Otherwise, you might, when you're, standing at the front of the courtroom, you might have a little bit of hemming and hawing to do, kind of a thing. There's no mandatory requirement for that, not in the current state, but yeah, it certainly would make you feel as a contractor much more confident in that. Um, Now, so we have cloud, right? And yeah, the cloud is great. Everybody loves the cloud. We can go to the cloud and we can get all kinds of stuff from there. So we can get infrastructure as a service, we can get platform as a service. How do these controls, and then in this environment where I've got a contractor and then I've got an external entity and they're responsible for some part of this, and I'm responsible as the contractor for another part of it. How does that really kind of play out if I'm maybe doing a platform as a service versus, and then I'm building on something on top of it, or I'm buying an infrastructure and I'm building on top of it? Am I automatically FedRAMP everything, or how do these controls get applied in this dynamic of multiple entities?
That is a phenomenal question. A phenomenal question. Many people have this misunderstanding and they believe, and we've had companies to come to us and they say, well, we're going to build our environment in a FedRAMP environment. So therefore, we are FedRAMP. And that couldn't be further from the truth. FedRAMP has, in no uncertain terms, said that every layer of the stack has to be FedRAMP authorized. What that means is the infrastructure as a service has to be FedRAMP authorized. The platform as a service has to be FedRAMP authorized. The software as a service has to be FedRAMP authorized. And the greatest example of that is Microsoft. Microsoft Azure Commercial, they're FedRAMP authorized. Microsoft Office 365 that runs on top of Azure Commercial is FedRAMP authorized. One is an infrastructure as a service, one is a software as a service. They're authorized separately because they both provide two separate functions. They probably could have had them authorized together, but it may not have made sense for them to do that, which is probably why they have them authorized separately. Now, it's a different story with Microsoft 365 Azure Government, and Office 365 GCC High, I believe that those authorizations are potentially together because it was actually built out differently versus how Azure Government was done versus how Microsoft 365 Commercial was done. Sometimes those decisions are made differently, but the stacks have to be certified or rather authorized at every level. So if by chance you have a company that wants to build a SIEM solution for audit log management, and you decide you want to build it in Amazon GovCloud because you want to offer it to the federal government, that's fine. That's a great place to start. Oh, by the way, if you want to offer it to the federal government, you can't go and build it in an infrastructure as a service that's not FedRAMP. If you build it in an infrastructure as a service that's not FedRAMP, get ready to build it again, because the only place that you can inherit FedRAMP authorization from is somewhere that's FedRAMP authorized. So if you build it in Amazon Web Services GovCloud, you will inherit those infrastructures as a service, but that doesn't mean full inheritance. There will be a shared responsibility matrix where it will tell you what you are responsible for and what they are responsible for. And you have to read those table and rules very carefully, because the assessors will read those table and rules very carefully. And I'll give you an example. I just so happened to have been reading SC7 earlier because I was talking to a colleague about SC7 earlier. Boundary protection for Amazon Web Services talks about the fact that for their software as a service, it's fully inherited, because all of the software that Amazon Web Services offers is fully inherited for Amazon Web Services infrastructure as a service. However, at the infrastructure as a service level, everything is not fully inherited. It's based on how you configure it. You receive partial inheritance, but everything that you build within Amazon's web services and everything that from a networking standpoint that you develop and all of the boundary devices that you virtually create, you're responsible for documenting and fully securing those boundary devices. They're not responsible for those devices from a boundary protection standpoint. So you have to be very careful about all of those different aspects of it.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I like the way you position that. So let's say, okay, we've got a company that has some FedRAMP approved infrastructure. Okay. And then there's another entity, a technology company that wants to build a solution on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then they want to sell then that solution to contractors. So we've got all these multiple kind of layers in there. We've got this FedRAMP infrastructure, but then I've got this entity that has built on top of that, and then they're going to turn around and try and sell that service to me. How does that play out when you talk about that shared responsibility matrix, where I've got, companies, because they can do that, right? They can, I can build on whatever platform I want. And if I just happen to choose a FedRAMP approved platform.
So there are several things at play in this scenario. So just for the purpose of the conversation, I'm going to make an assumption. And I'm just going to assume that the widget that's being built under CMMC asset categories, that it's going to be a security protection asset, because that's going to make it fun.
Okay.
We're going to assume it's a security protection asset. It's going to be a cloud managed vulnerability scanner.
Brilliant.
Be built on top of somebody's FedRAMP authorized solution, and they're going to build a product that's not going to be FedRAMP authorized, and they're going to sell it to DIB contractors.
Yes.
Well, the reason I wanted to use that as an example is because I wanted to say this: the gospel according to LinkedIn has been throwing out rumors lately. And the rumor is that the scenario that I just provided is that CMMC level 2, depending on whether that is considered a cloud service provider or whether or not that's an external service provider, there may be CMMC level 2 implications. And the difference would likely mean whether or not you buy additional services, such as, are they going to manage the vulnerability scanning for you in addition to just having the software as a service be used by you to do vulnerability scanning? If you just buy the software, they do vulnerability scanning, and you log in and you do all the management of it, cloud service provider. If you buy access to a cloud-based software that's going to have agents and it does vulnerability scanning, software as a service. But if somebody is behind the scenes, they're going to actually manage all of that for you. External service provider may have CMMC level 2 implications based on the gospel according to LinkedIn, right? So just be careful about everything that you see on LinkedIn. No rule is final yet. All we have is what the current rules are. The current rules would call that software a security protection asset, and that's what we know. It has to be included in your system security plan. And today, that's what we know. It will be included in your assessment today. The rules don't say that that product has to be FedRAMP. The rules say that it has to be included in your SSP and it'll be assessed against the applicable CMMC practices. That's what the rules say today. Now, if we switch the scenario a little bit and it's no longer a security protection asset, but it actually stores, processes, or transmits CUI, now you have a CUI asset. And now the rules today say that it needs to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent. Now you have a different scenario, and we go back to what you talked about in the beginning, where it needs to have that body of evidence to show, or the contractor has the responsibility to require and ensure that it's FedRAMP moderate equivalent. And that's where the challenge comes in, because do the contractors truly understand what that means to validate that they are FedRAMP moderate equivalent?
Yeah, that for me is the concern. We already know, um, based upon surveys from the DoD, and we know, uh, that things, controls are not in place, and there are a lot of contractors out there that aren't familiar with, you're not even aware of 7012, let alone familiar with 80171, let alone then trying to understand, right? And we talked a couple of shows about, hey, we got 770,000 open cybersecurity jobs. So it's not like there's this, huge set of bandwidth that they can all go to and get all these answers and get them cheap and fast. No, it's not there. So yeah, that understanding is a concern. And then that parlays into risk, because if you're not doing a good job, then you can run into some bad situations for sure. Now, we've got this FedRAMP moderate, and you mentioned the low and the medium, the low, the moderate, the high. So how does and the FAQs make some reference to this kind of stuff as well, but maybe expound on, okay, if we've got this stuff called FCI, and if we got CUI, and we've established that CUI is moderate as the minimum baseline, and maybe more kind of a thing. So I want to explore, well, what does more mean with this? You mentioned GCC high, so maybe elaborate on that. But then the other end of the spectrum, the low. So does that mean it's got to be a FedRAMP environment for cloud? Is there nothing here says FedRAMP low equivalent for federal contract information. So what do they do with that kind of information? So you got this FCI low hanging, lower stuff, and you got this possible higher CUI stuff. Maybe balance that out for us.
Well, from what I've seen, FAR 52-204-21 hasn't listed anything regarding federal contract information. So it would likely be up to an agency to add anything additional for a contract that would cover anything related to federal contract information. There
So
are
with the
agencies.
so for the cloud offerings that are out there today, would it be safe to say that without looking at the each and every cloud service providing, that the commercial offerings would tend to be just fine for this FCI stuff?
It's those 15 requirements. It's
Yeah.
access
Okay.
control, it's patch management, it's flaw remediation, it's malicious code protection, it's boundary protections. It's
Okay.
literally those basic 15, physical security. And as a matter of fact, it doesn't really mention anything much about transport security at all.
No. Right.
So yeah, the basics of security is really all it's talking about. There's not even a multi-factor authentication requirement as it relates to federal contract information.
Yeah, yeah, that's a yeah,
So when people
there's some
aren't
stuff in
meeting
there that I'm
those,
sorry, go ahead. I
I
kinda
just said
like
when people aren't meeting those, it's like these are like the bare minimums. So when you're not meeting federal, the requirements for federal contract information, you know, these are the lowest of the low requirements.
yeah, I look at FAR 52 and I cringe because when you don't even see things like, you know, basic security awareness training for your employees. It's like, when we know 75, 85% of all incidents have a human element, why on earth don't we have a base at the lowest basic level? Right. That one kind of blows my mind
I
all the
know why
time.
they took out, I know why they removed, or at least I have an idea of why they changed CMMC version 1 and took out the additional requirements. But I tell you that DNS filtering, that's in my opinion is a necessity, because if you're not going to have cyber awareness training, at least put DNS filtering in, because that's going to help with a lot of your phishing attempts and prevent links from causing compromises, because it's really going to help.
Yeah.
It really does help people from, if you do happen to click the link, it's going to prevent you from getting to it at least.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, sorry, I kind of interrupted your flow there. So that was the FCI stuff we were talking
Mhm.
about. So let's jump to the other end of the spectrum, the high. So again, nothing here, right? There is a mention that says that, hey, if there's more protection needed, we're gonna let you know. So you got that, but how does that play out in the FedRAMP space and this GCC and uh,
Well, there are two things that I want to mention that we, I think you did mention. I think you mentioned a part of it when I was listening earlier. One is the incident reporting requirement.
mm,
You could be FedRAMP, but that doesn't mean that you're meeting the last part. Well, not the last part. It doesn't mean that you're going to meet the incident reporting requirement that the Department of Defense has put out. The Department of Defense has an incident reporting requirement that says you're going to rapidly report cyber incidents within 72 hours, but it also has requirements that you're going to turn over information and that you're going to turn over media and things that are related to the cyber incident. And a lot of people don't understand
mhm,
why companies don't want to agree to do that. I have not heard companies say why they won't do it, but in the mind of Alexy, I have a reason why I believe they won't do it, and I believe it's related to customer retention and loyalty. Just take for example, you are a mega provider and you have a lot of companies. Now, let's just say you have one big hard drive and you have 50,000 customers on that one big hard drive, and there's an incident that happens, and you need to turn that hard drive over to the Department of Defense. They didn't sign up for that. So they don't want their data in the hands of the Department of Defense. So many companies say, now I'm not going to say that I'm going to meet the incident reporting requirements that are in the DFAR. So they may be FedRAMP moderate, but they have not said that they're going to meet the incident reporting requirements that are listed in the DFAR. So if they're not going to meet the incident reporting requirements, then you can't use them either. So it's not just FedRAMP moderate, it's also the
right.
incident reporting requirements. And I believe
Yeah. Good
Google
point.
Cloud recently came out and said, we'll meet it now. And I think it's because they were getting left behind.
Yeah.
if AWS is meeting it, and if Azure is meeting it, and even
Yeah.
Oracle is meeting it, well, guess what, Google, you better get on the bandwagon,
That's
because all
right.
these contracts are getting awarded and people are picking hyperscale solutions. And if you're not meeting it, a lot of these contractors are going to pick the other guys. So
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
mean guy in a sense to be exclusive, but they're picking the companies that are going to say we will do it. And so that is a big part of it. But to answer the second part that you're talking about, federal sovereignty is a big reason that you would take the switch. Little known fact that a lot of people are not aware of. When you start talking about Microsoft 365 or Office 365 commercial versus Office 365 GCC versus Office 365 GCC High versus Office 365 DoD, what's not often talked about is the two networks that those run on. You also have Azure Commercial and you have Azure Government. Azure Government powers Office 365 GCC High and Office 365 DoD, and it's ran by all US personnel. Azure Commercial powers Office 365 GCC and Office 365 Commercial. A lot of people aren't aware that Office 365 GCC actually runs on Azure Commercial in terms of the network. So certain types of CUI you can't put in Office 365 GCC because it doesn't meet the federal sovereignty requirements. So when you get into certain types of Department of Defense CUI that would have limited dissemination controls, or for those who are used to talking about distribution statements that say no foreign access, those are limited disseminations that are no foreign personnel, has to be US only. You can't put that in a space that has administrators that are foreign born, that are not US citizens, not foreign born, I take that back, that are not US citizens.
Right.
So you
Okay.
can't put that in Azure Commercial. It has to be in Azure Government. So at a minimum, you have to start with Office 365 GCC. So it's not so much as FedRAMP high, it's the federal sovereignty requirement has to be met. You
Yeah,
can
that
be in
sits
a
behind it.
FedRAMP moderate space and the federal sovereignty requirements still be met. An example of that, I believe, is Box.com. I think it's a FedRAMP 8 authorized system at the moderate impact level. But when you use Box Enterprise, they meet the federal sovereignty requirement so they can support US export controlled data being stored in that system.
Yeah, so that's brings up an excellent point, and I know a lot of organizations out there are struggling a bit with, yeah, well, what kind of information do I have? You know, because there maybe not there hasn't been maybe a great job being done up until now around marking and knowing, you know, well, what is it and what kind is it so that I can appropriately control it. And now they're all kind of looking back at some of this information that they have, and they go, I don't know what I got. Right? I've got this definition and feels like maybe I can get into these boxes, but a description and a definition of it might be two entirely different things. And I've got to make a decision. Okay, am I going to go the moderate, or do I need to jump up into high? Because to your point, yeah, maybe I've got this ITAR and ear stuff, and that tends to be maybe that thing that pushes you up above and beyond, but how do you really know? Well, okay, maybe if you go back and look at your contract and it says in there, okay, here's the enhanced protections you need to put on this kind of stuff, right?
Right. Those are the easy ones. I want to make a statement to somebody who may go back and listen to this, that it's a really simple statement. There's a definition for control technical information. And in that definition, it uses the word distribution statement. I can't number how many clients I've spoken with that will say, we don't have CUI, but they will say that they have data that has distribution statements. By definition, you have DoD CUI. You have control technical information, because that's what gets marked with distribution statements for the Department of Defense. So if you're listening and you have something that's marked with a distribution statement, you have CUI.
You got some CUI.
So all of that data is likely control technical information. If it's distribution statement D and you have anything lower than Office 365 GCC high, don't tell anybody, but move immediately out of that system and go to Office 365 GCC high immediately, because that's US only personnel that have access to administer that environment. When you're in Azure Commercial, you're committing export control violations. 100%.
Okay. So, all right. Yeah. So great. Yeah. Sage advice there, folks. All right. It's coming from the mouths of an expert. So pay close attention. All right. So the last thing I want to just kind of touch on before we wrap up, and because it's out there, it's kind of floating around, it's in the space, it's not necessarily directly being addressed or talked about, and maybe doesn't need to, but it's out there in this cloud space, and it's the DoD cloud security requirements, the CSGs, and for security level 4. Can you elaborate on that? What's it about? Do we care? Do we don't care? Why is this important to us or not important to us?
So it's a phenomenal question. We actually get this question, I won't say regularly, but I think it's an important topic to discuss, because it is important to understand who it applies to. So as a government contractor, sometimes you want to outsource your services to an external service provider. Well, the Department of Defense likes to do the same thing. That's the cloud service providers that the SRG applies to. Impact levels don't apply at all to Department of Defense contractors that the Department of Defense is not outsourcing their services to. So if you are a Department of Defense contractor that is utilizing a cloud service in the performance of a contract that you may have CUI that the Department of Defense has given you, and in the performance of your contract, you may store it in a cloud service provider. That doesn't pass the CCSRG requirements to you and require that cloud to be Impact Level 4. What Impact Level 4 in the Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide is for companies like Microsoft, where the Department of Defense has outsourced their email to. So rather than the Department of Defense maintaining their email servers, they've outsourced it to Microsoft. So now Microsoft, they have impact level requirements through the Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide because the Department of Defense has uplifted and outsourced compute requirements to Microsoft. So when they take requirements and shift it to somebody else in the cloud, they have to meet those Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guides. Not just a regular DIP contractor that's not doing cloud computing that's been outsourced to them. If it hasn't been outsourced to you as a cloud computing service to the government, you don't have to meet those requirements. The challenge is that sometimes you will have contracting officers who don't understand what they're asking you to do. And they will try to levy those requirements on you and say, is your email SRG Impact Level 4? It doesn't have to be. That's not your requirement. They're not outsourcing communications to your email provider. They're just sharing CUI with you. You have to meet NIST 800-171.
Yeah, brilliant. Alexy, it's been amazing. Really just outperformed. So thank you so much. I appreciate you being here. I'm really, really looking forward to part 2 where we dig into the evidence. Yeah. And maybe just kind of tee things up. Who are you bringing to the party for that one?
So we've actually worked with a company where we did a FedRAMP moderate equivalency assessment, capture 2 proposals. So we actually, once we found out about this, we reached out to them and asked if they would be willing to come on and actually share their body of evidence. And they graciously agreed to take part. So we're excited to bring them on as well because they had a good product. They had a good body of evidence. And so we think it would be a good opportunity to show a company that actually took pride in their work and took pride in their efforts to be able to, show other companies a way that it could be done effectively and efficiently. And that's what they did. So, they'll be excited about the opportunity and we're excited as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, for the, the folks in the CMMC world, this is going to be, this is really, rubber meets the road kind of stuff. This body of evidence, especially in the cloud space, should be very impactful. So, yeah, thank you again, Alexy. It's been great. Everyone else, stay tuned. Obviously, we've got lots of shows coming up, but our part 2 with Alexy and team scheduled for September 21st. The rest of you have a lovely evening. Thank you very much, Alexy. Alexy, it's been fantastic. Thank you.
Now you know you're feeling better after deep dosing on COC. Crump and Cyber did you good, babe. Gave you what you want, now you say. Well, we've got to go. See you next time we have the show. I know you love that COC. Crump and Cyber and be free.